By the time he was 32 years old, he was dead. By the time he was 20, he was already a king. And by the time he was 13, philosophers were already fighting over the privilege of teaching him. This is not the story of Alexander the Great, conqueror of Persia. Not yet. This is the story of how a teenage boy from a kingdom the rest of Greece, openly mocked as half-barbarian, became in less than a decade the most dangerous man in the ancient world, before he had even crossed into Asia. Stay with me, because the empire comes later. Tonight we go further back, to the beginning. 356 BC, Pella, capital of the kingdom of Macedon, a rugged, mountainous power on the northern edge of the Greek world, won the great southern cities like Athens still considered barely civilized. It's here, on a summer day the ancient sources place around the 20th of July, that a boy is born who will make every one of those southern cities kneel. His father is Philip II, king of Macedon, a battle-scarred, ruthlessly effective ruler in the middle of turning his fractured hill kingdom into the strongest military power Greece has ever seen. His mother is Olympias, a princess from Epirus, a woman ancient writers describe as intensely religious, fiercely intelligent, and, by every surviving account, every bit as unbending as the son she was about to raise. And almost immediately, the myths begin. The biographer Plutarch, writing more than 3 centuries later worth remembering, records that on the eve of her wedding, Olympias dreamed a bolt of lightning struck her womb, and fire spread outward before dying away. Philip, too, is said to have dreamed of sealing his wife's body shut with the image of a lion. Some in antiquity whispered that Alexander's real father wasn't Philip at all, but Zeus himself. Whether Olympias planted that rumor or was horrified by it, no ancient writer agrees. Maybe she wanted it left unclear. On the day of the birth, the omens supposedly kept coming. Philip, away besieging the city of Potidea, got 2 pieces of news on the same day. His general Parmenion had smashed a combined Illyrian and Paeonian army, and his horses had just won at the Olympic Games. And, so the story goes, that very same day, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, burned to the ground. One writer joked that the goddess had simply been too distracted attending the birth of Alexander to save her own temple. Here's the honest version. Almost all of this was very likely invented, or at least polished, after Alexander had already become a legend worth mythologizing backward. But that's exactly the point. These stories tell us what people needed to believe about him. That greatness this large couldn't have started ordinarily. It had to have been written in the sky from day one. His actual early childhood was much less mythical. He was raised by a nurse named Lenaike, sister of a soldier named Clitus, who would grow up to become one of Alexander's most trusted generals, and who would die by Alexander's own hand decades later in a drunken rage. Hold on that line. Don't explain it yet. It pays off in a future episode. For now, the boy is simply a boy, taught to read, to play the lyre, to ride, to hunt, to fight, under a strict tutor named Leonidas and another named Lysimachus. Here's the story that Macedonians would still be telling their children 2,000 years later. Around 344 BC, when Alexander was 12 or 13 years old, a horse trader from Thessaly brought a spectacular black stallion to Philip's court, asking an outrageous 13 talents for him. There was just one problem. The horse was unrideable. It reared and bucked at anyone who came near. Philip, unimpressed, told the trader to take it away. But the boy watching from the sidelines saw something the grown men in the yard had missed. The horse wasn't vicious. It was afraid of its own shadow, stretching and moving on the ground in front of it. Alexander asked for a chance to tame it. Philip, likely amused, agreed, on the condition that if the boy failed, he'd pay for the horse out of his own pocket. Alexander turned the horse to face the sun, so its shadow fell harmlessly behind it. He dropped his cloak, spoke to it low and steady, and then, in one motion, mounted and rode it at a full gallop. Philip is said to have wept with pride, and told his son that Macedon was too small a kingdom for his ambitions. Alexander named the horse Bucephalus, ox head, and for the next 2 decades, that horse carried him across deserts, mountain passes, and battlefields, all the way to the edge of India. Ancient sources actually disagree on how Bucephalus finally died. Some say simple old age, around 30. Others say he died from wounds at the brutal Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC. Either way, Alexander did something almost no ruler before him had ever done for an animal. He founded and named an entire city after his horse. If you want the seed of the man who would later conquer an empire, this is a good place to look. A boy who saw past a problem that had defeated grown men, and never once, for the rest of his life, forgot loyalty owed to something that had once carried him. At 13, Philip went looking for a tutor good enough for his heir. He considered the orator Isocrates. He considered Speusippus, head of Plato's own academy, who was so eager for the job he offered to resign his post to take it. In the end, Philip chose Aristotle, Plato's own former student, and soon to become one of the most influential thinkers in human history. As payment, Philip agreed to something extraordinary. He would rebuild Aristotle's hometown of Stagira, a city Philip's own army had previously destroyed, and free its enslaved citizens and pardon its exiles. One of the strangest tuition bills in history, a philosopher's price, paid in the resurrection of a ruined town. Philip set aside a retreat near Mysa, the so-called Temple of the Nymphs, as a classroom. It became something close to a boarding school for Alexander and the sons of the Macedonian elite. Ptolemy, future ruler of Egypt, Hephaestion, who would become Alexander's closest companion, many historians believe the love of his life, and Cassander, whose relationship with Alexander would sour into something far darker years later. Together, these boys formed the core of what history calls the companions, the generals and confidants who would follow Alexander to the edge of the known world. Aristotle's curriculum covered medicine, philosophy, ethics, religion, logic, art. But one book shaped Alexander more than any other, Homer's Iliad. Aristotle gave him a personally annotated copy, and Alexander is said to have kept it with him for the rest of his life, even on campaign, tucked beneath his pillow beside a dagger. In Achilles, brilliant, glory-obsessed, doomed, Alexander seems to have found not just a hero, but a rival to eventually surpass. He could reportedly recite the playwright Euripides from memory, too. And it's here, at Mysa, that Alexander gets his first real exposure to the empire he'll one day try to destroy. Philip's court had, for years, sheltered Persian exiles who'd fallen out with the Persian king Artaxerxes III, among them a nobleman named Artabazos and his daughter Barsine, a woman who'd later become linked romantically to Alexander himself, a future satrap named Amenapes, and a Persian noble named Sisenes. Growing up around them gave the Macedonian court an unusually intimate window into Persian politics, knowledge that would matter far sooner than anyone studying philosophy under an olive tree could have guessed. At 16, Alexander's classroom days ended, not because he'd learned everything Aristotle had to teach, but because Philip marched north to fight the Thracians and left his teenage son behind in Pella as regent of the entire kingdom. It didn't take long for that trust to be tested. While Philip was away, the Thracian Mede tribe revolted. Most 16-year-olds would wait for backup. Alexander didn't. He drove them out of their territory immediately, and then founded a new city on the site and named it, without a hint of modesty, Alexandropolis. He wasn't even 17 yet. When Philip returned, he sent his son out again, this time to crush revolts in southern Thrace. During a campaign against the Greek city of Perinthus, Alexander reportedly saved his father's life in battle. Not long after, Philip found a new excuse to intervene further south, when the town of Amphissa was accused of farming land sacred to Apollo. While Philip dealt with Thrace, he ordered Alexander to raise an army for a campaign into Greece. And to keep the nervous Greek city-states guessing, Alexander staged a feint, making it look like he was preparing to strike Illyria instead. Clever misdirection for a teenager, though it almost backfired when the Illyrians, apparently believing the ruse, actually invaded Macedonian territory. Alexander drove them back too. By 338 BC, father and son had reunited their armies, forced their way through the pass at Thermopylae, and occupied the city of Elatea, just days' march from both Athens and Thebes. Panic spread through southern Greece. Athens, led by the fiery orator Demosthenes, rushed to ally with its old rival Thebes against the Macedonian threat. Both sides sent envoys trying to win Thebes over. Athens won that argument. The battlefield argument was still to come. August 338 BC. The armies meet on the plain near the small Boeotian town of Chaeronea, and what happens next ends, permanently, the age of the independent Greek city-state. Philip commands the right wing. His 18-year-old son commands the left, trusted with an entire flank, though surrounded by Philip's most seasoned generals just in case. The armies collide and grind against each other for hours. At the critical moment, Philip orders his own line to fall back, a deliberate, calculated retreat, designed to lure the inexperienced Athenian citizen soldiers into breaking formation to chase what looks like a fleeing enemy. It works. As the Athenian line surges forward, gaps tear open in their ranks. On the other flank, Alexander sees his opening and takes it, leading the charge that shatters the elite Theban infantry. The legendary Sacred Band, long considered unbeatable. It's Alexander, not his father, who lands the battle's first decisive blow. Philip's veterans follow his lead. The Macedonian line surges forward, and the enemy formation collapses. Cut off from their allies, the Thebans are surrounded and crushed. Chaeronea breaks the last serious resistance to Macedonian power in Greece. Philip and Alexander march into the Peloponnese almost completely unopposed, devastating Laconia and pushing Sparta out of territory it's held for generations. At Corinth, Philip gathers delegates from nearly every Greek city, everyone except Sparta, which refuses to bow, and forms what history calls the League of Corinth. Philip is named hegemon, supreme commander, and in front of the assembled Greeks, he announces something no Greek leader has ever pulled off: an invasion of the Persian Empire itself. He will never get the chance to lead it. Victory on the battlefield didn't buy peace at home. Back in Pella, Philip fell for a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, niece of one of his generals, Attalus, and married her. On its own, this wasn't unusual. Philip had married 7 or 8 times for political alliance, but this marriage was different and dangerous for one specific reason. Unlike Alexander, whose mother was a foreign princess from Epirus, any son born to Cleopatra Eurydice would be Macedonian on both sides. Overnight, Alexander's once unquestionable claim to the throne looked a lot less secure. At the wedding feast, Attalus, deep in his cups, raised a toast, praying the marriage would produce a legitimate heir to the kingdom. It was not subtle, and Alexander did not let it go. According to Plutarch, he hurled a drinking cup at Attalus's head and demanded whether Attalus considered him a bastard. Philip, enraged, drew his sword and lunged at his own son, and then tripped, undone by wine and rage, sprawling on the floor in front of the entire court. Alexander looked down at him and delivered one of the sharpest lines of his youth, mocking the man who planned to invade an entire continent, but couldn't even cross a room without falling over. The rift didn't heal on its own. Within the year, Alexander fled Macedon with his mother, dropped her at her brother's court in Epirus, and continued alone into Illyria, where, remarkably, he found shelter among the very Illyrian kings his own army had defeated in battle a few years earlier. 6 months later, through the mediation of a family friend named Demaratus, he came home, and an uneasy peace settled over the palace. It didn't last. The following year, a Persian governor named Pixodarus offered his daughter in marriage to Alexander's half-brother, Philip Oridaeus, a man ancient sources describe as having a cognitive disability, and therefore no real threat to the succession. Olympius and Alexander's friends convinced him this was a sign Philip meant to elevate Aridaeus instead. Alexander overreacted, secretly sending an actor to tell Pixodarus he should offer his daughter to Alexander, not to an illegitimate half-brother. When Philip found out, he was furious, not because his plans had changed, but because his son had humiliated himself chasing the hand of a minor foreign governor's daughter. Philip exiled 4 of Alexander's closest friends and had the actor dragged home in chains. Worth pausing on, Alexander's relationship with his father was never simple. Admiration, ambition, rivalry, suspicion, all of it tangled together. And it was about to matter more than anyone in that palace could have guessed. October 336 BC. The royal court gathers at the old capital of Aigai for a wedding, Alexander's sister Cleopatra marrying her own uncle, the king of Epirus. It's meant to be a celebration, a show of Macedonian unity before the great invasion of Persia Philip has spent years preparing. Instead, it becomes one of the most consequential assassinations in ancient history. As Philip enters the theater in procession, deliberately walking a step ahead of his bodyguards to show the Greek world he fears nothing from his own people, one of those very bodyguards, a young man named Pausanias, steps forward and drives a blade into the king's chest. Philip dies instantly. Pausanias runs for waiting horses, trips over a vine, and is cut down before he can explain himself, by, among others, 2 of Alexander's own companions. Ancient historians never agreed on Pausanias's real motive, and modern historians still argue about it today. What's certain is this: the king who spent 23 years turning Macedon from a fractured hill kingdom into the master of Greece is dead in an instant, at the exact moment his greatest ambition, the war against Persia, was about to begin. On the spot, amid the chaos, the army and nobility proclaim Alexander king. He is 20 years old. No king takes an army across the sea without first guaranteeing no one can strike his homeland the moment his back is turned. In spring 335 BC, Alexander marches north to make sure of exactly that. From Amphipolis, he pushes into the territory of the independent Thracians. At Mount Haemus, his army fights its way up through defended heights and breaks the resistance. He then defeats the Triballi near the Liganus River, a Danube tributary, and pushes on for 3 more days until he reaches the Danube itself, where the Getae tribe waits on the far bank, confident the river alone will stop him. They're wrong. Alexander crosses the Danube by night, catches the Getae completely off guard, and routs them in a single brief engagement. Then word arrives that the Illyrian chieftain Clitus and King Glaucius of the Taulanti, some of the very people who once sheltered Alexander during his exile, have risen in open revolt. He marches west, defeats them both, and forces them to flee. His northern and western borders are, for the moment, secure. The road east finally looks clear. It isn't. While Alexander campaigns in the north, a rumor spreads through Greece that he's died in battle. It's false, but it's enough. Thebes, still smarting from Chaeronea, rises again. Athens, emboldened, starts preparing to follow. Alexander doesn't wait to see how far the rumor spreads. He turns south immediately, and the sheer speed of his approach stuns most of Greece into wary silence. Every city hesitates, except Thebes. Thebes chooses to fight. It doesn't last. Alexander's forces break through, and what follows is one of the harshest punishments one Greek city ever inflicted on another. Thebes, the city of Oedipus, of the poet Pindar, of the once unbeatable sacred band Alexander himself had helped destroy years earlier, is razed almost entirely. Its land is divided among the neighboring cities that had sided with Macedon. The message lands exactly as intended. Athens, on the verge of revolt weeks earlier, backs down completely. For the first time in years, all of Greece falls into peace, not because anyone wanted it, but because everyone had just seen the cost of refusing it. Spring, 334 BC. Alexander crosses the Dardanelles into Asia, leaving his general Antipater behind in Europe, with over 13,000 troops to hold Greece and Macedon secure. He himself commands roughly 30,000 infantry and more than 5,000 cavalry, nearly 14,000 of them Macedonians, the rest allied troops supplied by the Greek League. It's a genuinely mixed force, light-armed Cretan and Macedonian archers, Thracian skirmishers, Agrianian javelin throwers. But the real striking power sits with the cavalry, backed by a core infantry phalanx 9,000 strong, armed with 13-foot spears, and the 3,000 men of his elite royal guard, the Hypaspists. His second in command is Parmenion, a veteran who'd already secured a foothold in Asia Minor under Philip. And traveling with the army, this is worth pausing on, are surveyors, engineers, architects, scientists, and historians. From the very first crossing, Alexander is planning something with no obvious ceiling. Before the fighting starts, Alexander makes a stop that tells you exactly how he sees himself. The ruins of Troy. He lays a wreath at what was believed to be Achilles' tomb, a deliberate, theatrical gesture, invoking the hero he'd worshipped since childhood, on the very ground where the Iliad was set. Then, in May or June of 334 BC, he meets his first Persian army at the Granicus River, near the Sea of Marmara. 3 Persian satraps command the opposing force, and their plan is simple. Lure Alexander's cavalry across the river and cut them down in the chaos of the crossing. It nearly works. Accounts describe Alexander himself in the thick of the melee, in real danger. But the Persian line breaks, and the victory is total. Darius's Greek mercenaries, Greeks fighting for the Persian side, are largely killed in the aftermath. 2,000 survivors are sent home to Macedonia in chains, a harsh but calculated message about what happens to Greeks who fight for Persia. The victory blows Western Asia Minor wide open. City after city opens its gates without a fight. And here's something genuinely important, easy to miss in the battle narrative. Alexander expels local tyrants and installs democracies, the opposite of what Macedon was doing back in Greece itself. As part of his coordinated propaganda campaign, he sends 300 captured suits of Persian armor to Athens, dedicated to the goddess Athena, with an inscription crediting Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, except the Spartans. Notice what's missing from that inscription: any mention of Macedonia at all. He is deliberately selling this as a Greek war of liberation, not a Macedonian conquest. Through the winter of 334 to 333 BC, Alexander subdues the rest of Western Asia Minor, the hill tribes of Lycia and Pisidia, the resistant city of Halicarnassus, which he takes by siege. Here's a detail that captures how he actually operated, not just as a conqueror, but as a political strategist. At Halicarnassus, the local ruler's sister Ada, who'd been ousted by her own brother, formally adopts Alexander as her son. He restores her to power. In exchange, he gets a loyal, grateful satrap running one of the most strategically important cities on the coast. By spring 333 BC, he reaches Gordium in Phrygia, and here we get one of the most famous stories in the entire Alexander legend. Local tradition held that an ancient, impossibly complex knot bound to an old chariot could only be untied by the future ruler of Asia. Alexander is said to have simply cut it apart with his sword. It's a fantastic story, and worth being honest on camera about the fact that some ancient historians themselves suspected the tale was exaggerated or invented after the fact, precisely because it fit his image so perfectly. Autumn 333 BC. The Persian king Darius III personally takes command of a massive royal army and marches to meet Alexander. Both sides badly misjudge the other's position, and Alexander finds himself outmaneuvered geographically, with Darius's army now positioned north of him, astride his own supply lines, near the town of Issus. Alexander turns his army around and finds Darius drawn up along the Pinarus River. What follows is a decisive Macedonian victory. The Persian line collapses into a full rout, and Darius himself flees the battlefield, abandoning his own mother, wife, and children, who fall into Alexander's hands. Ancient sources consistently describe Alexander treating the royal women with notable courtesy and restraint, a detail that became part of his broader public image as a magnanimous conqueror rather than a mere plunderer. From Issus, Alexander turns south into Syria and Phoenicia, not chasing Darius directly, but pursuing a different strategic goal entirely: strangling the Persian navy by taking every port city it depends on. City after city submits peacefully. Then he reaches Tyre, and Tyre refuses him entry. What follows is, by most assessments, Alexander's single greatest military engineering achievement: a 7-month siege of an island city, involving the construction of a massive causeway out into open water under constant bombardment. During the siege, Darius sends an extraordinary peace offer: an enormous ransom of 10,000 talents for his captured family, along with the cession of all Persian territory west of the Euphrates. According to the ancient sources, Alexander's general Parmenion said he would accept those terms if he were Alexander. Alexander's famous reply: he would too, if he were Parmenion. Tyre finally falls in July 332 BC, and the ancient accounts describe it as a brutal sack, with heavy casualties and the enslavement of surviving women and children. Moving south, Alexander meets fierce, unexpected resistance at Gaza, holding out for 2 months, and personally sustaining a serious shoulder wound during the fighting. One thing worth stating clearly on camera, since it's a persistent modern myth: there is no reliable historical basis for the popular story that Alexander detoured to visit Jerusalem during this campaign. That tradition is a later legend, not supported by contemporary sources. November 332 BC. Alexander enters Egypt, and the Persian satrap there simply surrenders. The Egyptians, who had long resented Persian rule, welcome him as a liberator rather than a conqueror. At Memphis, he makes ritual sacrifice to the sacred bull Apis, and is formally crowned with the double crown of the pharaohs, deliberately working within Egyptian religious tradition, rather than against it. That winter, on a stretch of coastline between the sea and Lake Mareotis, protected by the island of Pharos, he founds a city that will outlive every empire he ever builds, Alexandria. He commissions the Rhodian architect Dinocrates to lay it out. It's one of somewhere around 70 cities ancient sources credit Alexander with founding across his campaigns, Plutarch's figure, most of them named, without much subtlety, after himself. Then comes one of the strangest and most consequential side trips of his entire life, a difficult desert journey to the oracle of the god Ammon at the Siwa oasis. When he arrives, the priest greets him with the traditional pharaonic salutation, as the son of Ammon. Alexander asks the oracle a private question about the success of his campaign, and never reveals the answer to anyone. This single, deliberately mysterious episode becomes one of the seeds of a much larger idea that will grow across the rest of his life. The notion, encouraged by Alexander himself in certain later moments, that he might be something more than an ordinary king. By July 331 BC, Alexander is at Thapsacus on the Euphrates, pushing toward Mesopotamia. Rather than following the river directly toward Babylon, he cuts north toward the Tigris, and Darius, scrambling to intercept him, marches up to meet him on ground of his own choosing, a broad, flat plain near Nineveh, perfect for his enormous cavalry force and scythed war chariots called Gaugamela. October 1st, 331 BC. This is the single most consequential day of the entire war. Darius's army vastly outnumbers Alexander's. Ancient sources vary wildly on the exact figures, some claiming numbers that are almost certainly exaggerated for effect. But even conservative modern estimates put the Persians at well over double the Macedonian strength. Alexander's tactics are the story here. He deliberately angles his formation, drawing the Persian line to stretch and thin as it tries to outflank him, then drives a concentrated cavalry wedge directly at the gap that opens in the Persian center. The Persian line breaks. Darius, again, flees the field, and this time his flight effectively ends the war. Alexander pursues the retreating Persians some 35 miles to Arbela, but Darius escapes with his Bactrian cavalry and Greek mercenaries into the region of Media. Gaugamela is, in the plainest possible terms, the day the 200-year-old Achaemenid Persian Empire dies. Alexander is now, for all practical purposes, master of the ancient Near East. Alexander occupies Babylon without a fight. The city surrenders, and its governor Mazaeus is confirmed in his post, working alongside a Macedonian military commander, an early example of Alexander's developing policy of governing through existing local elites, rather than replacing them wholesale. The pattern repeats at Susa, the Persian administrative capital, which surrenders and hands over a genuinely staggering treasury. Ancient sources put the figure at around 50,000 gold talents. Pushing on through the Zagros Mountains into the Persian heartland itself, Alexander forces the heavily defended Persian gates and enters Persepolis and the older royal city of Pasargadae. And here happens one of the most debated episodes of his entire career. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital and spiritual heart of the Achaemenid dynasty, Alexander burns down the palace of Xerxes, the very king who, over a century earlier, had burned Athens during the Greco-Persian Wars. Ancient tradition offers two very different explanations. One, that it was a calculated political statement, marking the symbolic end of the Greek War of Revenge against Persia. The other, recorded but treated skeptically even by ancient historians, that it was an impulsive act during a drunken celebration, allegedly encouraged by an Athenian courtesan named Thais. Modern historians generally lean toward the first explanation as more historically grounded, but honestly, we can't fully rule out both playing some role. By spring 330 BC, with Media occupied and the Thessalian and Greek allied troops sent home, something quietly but fundamentally shifts. From this point forward, Alexander isn't leading a pan-Hellenic war of Greek revenge against Persia anymore. He's fighting a personal war of his own, before continuing his pursuit of Darius, who has retreated deep into Bactria. Alexander makes a decision that reveals just how much his thinking about empire is evolving. He begins governing conquered territory through a genuine partnership of Macedonians and Persians together, rather than simple military occupation. It is a policy that will, in time, cause serious friction with his own men. In midsummer 330 BC, moving at extraordinary speed, Alexander learns that Darius has been deposed and taken prisoner by his own subordinate, a satrap named Bessus. After a skirmish, Bessus has the deposed king stabbed and left to die rather than let him fall into Macedonian hands alive. Alexander finds Darius's body and sends it back to Persepolis for burial with full royal honors, a calculated gesture of respect for a defeated rival, and also, not incidentally, a way of positioning himself as Darius's legitimate successor rather than simply his conqueror. It's also here, in this same stretch of the campaign, that the war turns genuinely dark within Alexander's own camp. At Frada in Drangiana, Philotas, son of the veteran general Parmenion and commander of Alexander's elite companion cavalry, is implicated in an alleged assassination plot, condemned and executed. Alexander then has a secret order sent ahead to have Parmenion himself, a man who had served Philip and Alexander loyally for decades, assassinated as well, before news of his son's execution could reach him. Ancient sources describe this as provoking widespread horror, even among Alexander's own supporters, even as it eliminated the last major internal check on his authority. Through the brutal winter of 330 to 329 BC, Alexander pushes his army over the Hindu Kush and into the territory of modern Afghanistan and Central Asia, founding another city, Alexandria by the Caucasus, along the way. Bessus, the man who murdered Darius, is now attempting to raise a rebellion in the eastern satrapies under the self-declared title of Great King. Alexander crosses the brutal Kawak Pass, over 11,000 feet, and pursues him across the Oxus River. Bessus is eventually betrayed by his own allies, captured and, following Persian custom for punishing usurpers, mutilated before ultimately being executed. But the harder fight is still coming. A resistance leader named Spidomenes raises the region of Sogdiana into a full revolt, and it takes Alexander until autumn 328 BC to finally crush what ancient historians describe as the most determined and dangerous opposition he faced anywhere in his entire campaign. It's during this same brutal stretch of fighting that Alexander captures a mountain stronghold and, among the prisoners, finds a young noblewoman named Roxana. He marries her, a genuine political marriage meant to help stabilize a hard-won region, and, by most ancient accounts, at least in part a marriage of real personal attraction as well. At Marikonda, modern Samarkand, something happens that permanently changes how many of Alexander's own men see him. During a drunken banquet, an argument escalates between Alexander and Clitus, one of his oldest, most trusted commanders, the same Clitus, whose sister Lanike had nursed Alexander as an infant, the same man who had personally saved Alexander's life years earlier at the Granicus. In a fit of rage, Alexander kills him with a spear. His remorse afterward is, by every account, immediate and extreme. But the episode marks a turning point. It's around this same period that Alexander begins adopting elements of Persian royal dress, and shortly afterward, at Bactra, he attempts to introduce the Persian court custom of proskynesis, a ritual act of prostration before the king, and require it of his Greek and Macedonian officers as well as his Persian subjects. To Persians, this gesture simply signified respect for royal authority. To Greeks and Macedonians, prostrating yourself before another human being was something reserved for worship of the gods, and it was, to them, genuinely intolerable. Even Callisthenes, the court historian and Aristotle's own nephew, refuses to comply, and Macedonian mockery of the whole idea eventually forces Alexander to abandon it. Not long after, Callisthenes is implicated in a separate conspiracy among the royal pages and is executed, or dies in custody. The ancient sources themselves don't agree on exactly which, and the episode badly damages Alexander's standing among Greek intellectuals more broadly. Early summer, 327 BC. Alexander leads a reorganized army back over the Hindu Kush and pushes into India, modern Pakistan and northwestern India. He splits his forces, sending half through the Khyber Pass while he personally leads the rest through the northern hill country, where his engineers pull off another extraordinary siege, storming the seemingly impregnable mountain stronghold of Iornos. In spring, 326 BC, after crossing the Indus, a local ruler named Taxiles allies with Alexander against his own regional rival, King Porus, who controls the territory across the Hydaspes River, modern-day Jhelum, in Pakistan. In June 326 BC, Alexander fights what will become his final large-scale pitched battle, crossing the flooded river at night to catch Porus by surprise. It's a hard-fought, costly victory. Porus's army includes war elephants, a genuinely novel challenge Alexander's cavalry had never faced before. Impressed by his opponent's courage in defeat, Alexander doesn't depose Porus. He restores him to his throne as an ally. Alexander founds 2 cities on this battlefield, Nicaea, to commemorate the victory, and Bucephala, named after his own horse, Bucephalus, who dies here, either from wounds sustained in the battle, or, by another account, simply from old age at around 30. Alexander wants to keep pushing east. There's genuine historical uncertainty about exactly how much he actually knew of the lands beyond, though there's no solid evidence he'd yet heard specifically of the Ganges. But at the Hyphasis River, likely the modern Bees, his army finally refuses to go any further. After 8 years of continuous campaigning, in brutal monsoon conditions, exhausted in body and spirit, they mutiny. One of his own senior commanders, Conus, speaks for them. Alexander, after days of stubborn refusal, ultimately gives in and agrees to turn back. The only time in his entire career his own will fails to move his army forward. Before turning back, Alexander builds a massive fleet on the Hydaspes, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 ships, and sails down the Indus, part of his army on the water, part marching along both banks. It's a brutal campaign in its own right, heavy, often merciless fighting the entire way, including one siege where Alexander himself takes a severe wound that leaves him seriously weakened for some time afterward. Reaching the mouth of the Indus, he splits his forces for the journey home. His admiral Nearchus takes a fleet to explore a sea route along the Persian Gulf coast, while Alexander leads part of the army overland through the Gedrosian Desert, modern Baluchistan. This decision turns into one of the worst disasters of his entire career. Waterless terrain, catastrophic shortages of food and fuel, and, most tragically, many people, especially women and children traveling with the army, killed in a sudden flash flood while the column was encamped in a dry riverbed. It's a stretch of the story worth being honest about on camera. Not every chapter of this campaign is a triumph. Back in Persian territory, Alexander begins a harsh new phase of governance. Over the following 2 years, more than a third of his provincial governors are replaced, and several are executed for corruption or mismanagement. Whether this represents legitimate punishment for genuine abuses during his long absence, or simply Alexander eliminating men he no longer trusted, is something ancient sources themselves debate, and honestly, we still can't fully settle it today. In spring 324 BC, back in Susa, Alexander stages an enormous ceremony. He and roughly 80 of his officers formally marry Persian noblewomen in a mass wedding meant to physically embody his vision of a unified Macedonian Persian ruling class. Alexander himself marries 2 of Darius's daughters. Thousands of his ordinary soldiers, who had taken native wives informally over the years of campaigning, received generous dowries as well. This whole policy, genuine political and cultural fusion between Macedonians and Persians, provokes deep, growing resentment among his own Macedonian veterans, who see Persian officers being welcomed into elite cavalry units and the royal bodyguard as a direct threat to their own status. The tension finally boils over at Opis in 324 BC, when Alexander orders his aging Macedonian veterans sent home, and appears to be preparing to rely more heavily on Persian troops instead. It nearly becomes an open mutiny, until Alexander, in a dramatic move, dismisses his entire army on the spot and begins enrolling Persians directly in their place. The gambit works, his own men back down, and an emotional reconciliation follows, capped with a mass banquet reportedly attended by 9,000 guests, celebrating what was framed as a new partnership between Macedonians and Persians in governing the empire together. With Greece finally silent, Alexander leaves a trusted general, Antipater, to govern in his absence, and turns, at last, fully toward the sea, and beyond it, toward the empire his father spent his final years preparing to invade. He is not yet 22. He has survived his father's fury, his mother's ambitions, exile, and a king's assassination. He tamed a horse no one else could ride. He studied under one of history's greatest philosophers. He broke the finest infantry in Greece before he was out of his teens. He crossed the Danube by night and burned one of the great cities of the ancient world to the ground as a warning to every city still watching. Everything up to this point was preparation. What comes next? The crossing into Asia, the battles at the Granicus, at Issus, at Gaugamela, the unraveling of the Persian Empire, the long march to India, and the longer road home. That's the next chapter. But remember him here first, standing on the edge of Europe, looking east. Because whatever he becomes, this is where it started. With a boy who refused to be told, a horse couldn't be tamed, a kingdom couldn't be won, or a destiny could be anything smaller than the whole known world.